Rolling.
Good afternoon. My name is Sam Tschappler. Today I'll be presenting a speech on the issue of international terrorism. My speech is entitled Green Tide Rising: How Islamic Jihadism Must Be Defeated. What is happening in Egypt? The nation seems to be spiraling out of control, caught in a net of violence and chaos. Recently, 683 Muslim Brotherhood followers have been sentenced to death as a new military government consolidates its strength. This sentence includes Mohamed Morsi, the formerly elected president of Egypt. Before this sentence, 527 Muslim Brotherhood followers have been sentenced, a total of 1,210 Egyptians sentenced to death. Here in America, we are confused and troubled by these issues. What does all this mean? What are we to do about it? And who are the real enemies here? The Middle East is a complicated region, which, quite frankly, seems to scare most Americans. The simple reason that most Americans know very little about it. But this does not have to be the case. In this speech, I'd like to explain some of the factors at work in the Middle East and explain the steps necessary to protect the United States from terrorist organizations. But first, I'd like to present some background on the issue. International terrorism is not a new issue. In fact, its history goes back long before the September 11, 2001 attacks. Al-Qaeda, one of the largest and best-known international terror organizations, has been responsible for terrorist attacks since the mid-1990s. More recently, Al-Qaeda has undergone a major change in structure. Instead of a closely-knit, centrally controlled organization, Al-Qaeda has come to resemble a Papa John's franchise with loosely connected branches in many nations. Its leadership has become much less centralized, to the point that Al-Qaeda has been described as a regional syndicate. This change in structure is making Al-Qaeda very hard to defeat, not to imply that the struggle was easy in the first place. In fact, since 2001, the global war on terror has cost the United States almost $1.5 trillion, and 300,000 lives have been lost, almost half of them civilians. In this speech, I'll contend that cultural reform of the Middle East is necessary to defeat Islamic jihadism. In proving this thesis, I'll present three primary points. First, I'd like to explain how Arabic culture both influences and is influenced by radical Arabs in Arabic societies. Next, I'll contend that trying to change a culture is morally justifiable. And last but certainly not least, I'll explain some specific methods for reducing international terrorism. My first contention is to explain how Arabic culture contributes to the phenomenon of terrorism. To start with, I'd like to explain that Arab culture differs from American culture in several key points, first and foremost of which is the idea of responsibility. Arab men have a tendency to blame their wives, sisters, and daughters for everything. Before I'm accused of generalizing, I must make it clear that this is not just a slight difference. Lying is actually encouraged in Arabic culture, because admitting that you're wrong or made a mistake is seen as losing face. Just like Arab men blame their wives and daughters for their problems, it is the practice of Arabic national leaders to blame various scapegoats for national problems, especially the United States and Israel. Israel and the West are portrayed as evil and as destroying all the good that Arabic culture stands for. It has been said that a tyrant requires an enemy to stay in power. Arabic governments are generally not only despotic, but also largely inept. Thus, the fear of outside enemies is necessary for these governments to maintain their power. In this case, Israel and the West serve as the bad guys. This bad guy mentality trickles all the way down to the individual Muslim, who views Israel as evil and trying to dominate the world, and America as a cesspool of immorality. Although Arabic culture is largely dissimilar to American culture, there are also similarities. One such similarity is the deep division of the culture. Much like progressives and conservatives in the United States, Arab nations are politically split in a number of different ways. Most importantly to us, they're divided into radical and moderate elements. The radical elements usually form no more than 15% of the population of a nation, but they hold the other 85% of the nation in fear through their threats and violence. It is this small radical element which carries out attacks against the U.S. and which fills the streets of Arab nations with violence, propaganda, and flat-out lies about the West, all in the name of Allah. Simply because only 15% of the population can be properly identified as radicals, certainly doesn't mean that the rest of the population is innocent. In fact, most Muslims are neutral or tacitly support the actions of the radicals. Thus the radicals feed off of the support of the masses, and the Muslim masses are influenced by the propaganda of the radicals, a never-ending loop in which hatred for the West steadily grows. There is one last reason why Arab culture needs to change. As long as Arabs consider all non-Muslims as heretics, the true word of God can make little headway in Arabic nations. The relaxation of hatred towards the West on the part of the Arab peoples would make evangelism in Arab nations significantly easier, although this is a religious rather than a social or political reason for changing the Arab culture. It is perhaps the most important reason for Christians. Now that we have looked at how the culture of the Middle East contributes to terrorism, I'd like to move on to my next contention. In this contention, I'll explain that changing a culture, such as the Arab culture, is morally justifiable. As Americans, we have a long history of tolerance of many cultures, so many people are likely to ask, is it okay to try to change someone else's culture? The main justification for attacking culture is found in history. In fact, it can be contended that every great international war was a clash of cultures. From the Battle of Salamis, which caused the fall of the Persian culture, to the Crusades, which proved the dominance of Christian over Muslim culture, to the American Revolution, which showed the decline of the British culture, to, most recently, the fall of the Berlin Wall, which showed the failure of the communist culture. All these battles have been clashes between cultures. This clash between the Western and Arab culture is not unprecedented. But what is unprecedented is that historically a culture has been defeated by military and economic might, not by direct cultural attack. The goal in this case, instead of trying to defeat the opponent militarily, is to change a culture from within. It is still a clash of cultures, but simply because a clash of cultures is justified, is this method of winning the clash justified? The answer to that question is yes. Muslim terrorists do not submit to the rules of armed combat and try to instill a culture of terror in their opponents. Thus, we as their opponents are justified in trying to break the culture of fear that they have created around their own people as a way of defending ourselves. There are many possible objections to this idea of trying to change Arab culture. To start with, it can be argued that the actions of Muslim terrorists can be justified as a reaction in defense against the immoral culture of the West. The problem with this idea is that it is only partially true. The Arab world might have valid complaints against the West, but radical elements have turned these issues from problems to be resolved into causes of sheer irrational hatred. The complaints that Arabs have against Westerners are not the cause of terrorism, but rather a tool that terrorists use to inflame the masses. It can also be argued that terrorism is a result of poor economic circumstances. Effectively, that poverty causes terrorism. Statistics, however, do not support this claim. Poor Islamic nations or Islamic nations with declining economies do not have higher levels of terrorism than richer countries or countries with rising economies. Having explained the necessity of cultural change for the Arab world and the moral justification for that cultural change, the question quickly arises, what exactly does this cultural change look like? How are we to change the Arab culture to make it less threatening to the West? In my last contention, I'd like to explain specific methods for reducing the phenomenon of international terrorism. In short, America needs to win the war for the heart of Islam. The deep divide between the radicals and the moderates in Arab culture is the root of most conflict in the Muslim world, and the existence of radical factions is a cause of terrorism against the West. Thus, by reducing or eliminating these radical factions, violence by Arabs, both against their neighboring Arabs and against the West, can be reduced or eliminated. There are two primary methods that I believe should be employed against radical Islamic factions: supporting secular rather than Islamic governments in Muslim countries, and attacking radical factions within Muslim nations. There are not many secular governments of Muslim nations, but one good example is the nation of Turkey. Turkey has a free market, a remarkable degree of civil liberties for a Middle Eastern nation, and a membership in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Many Muslim nations under the leadership of radical Islamists consider Turkey as a threat, which simply highlights the United States should support Turkey and push for secular governments in other nations in the area. In addition to supporting secular governments, the U.S. needs to attack radical factions on their own soil. There are a variety of strategies to do this. The recent Hosni Mubarak of Egypt and King Hussein of Jordan, although certainly not considered friendly to the West, have both felt threatened by radical factions within their nations. It would be in the best interest of the United States to aid such leaders in their battle against these radical factions, in the American State Department's tradition of supporting the lesser evil against the greater. In this speech, I have tried to prove that cultural reform in the United States, in the Middle East, will be required to defeat Islamic jihadism. To prove this, I have presented three main points. First, that the culture of the Middle East encourages terrorism. Second, that attempting to reform the culture of the Middle East is morally justifiable. And last, that there are specific things that America can do to combat terrorism at the cultural level. The threat of communism seems to be gone now, but we must be wary of new threats on the global landscape. It is vital that we recognize that the so-called green threat of Islamic jihadism is just as much of a threat to our nation as the so-called red threat of communism was. Current military strategy in the Middle East has only enjoyed a limited degree of success. We must employ new strategies if we are to stem the green tide of Islamic jihadism. Thank you.
Questions?
Comments, gripes, or complaints? Yes.
You say that changing culture is justifiable, but looking back on our tradition of a nation as tolerance, how can we convince ourselves that we are really the ones in the right and that we're not the ones in the wrong?
Simply by the fact that we are not the ones who advocate mass killings.
Well, if we look internally within our nation, we see that we are imprisoning mass amounts of people who are advocating their religious beliefs, so aren't their killings justified?
That's true. Well, so effectively you're saying that the West needs to have a moral superiority in order to undertake the strategy.
Yes.
So the West has declined. Western cultures are not as free as they once were. However, I do not think that it is excessive to say that Western cultures are still the freest on earth, and that they still support the largest degree of human rights of any group of nations on earth. Does that answer your question mostly?
I think so.
Everybody's looking at me like...
It didn't sound like it answered the question. Ask your question one more time, Zach.
Do you have a better grasp of my question? Like a better way to state it?
You're saying, who are we to declare our superiority over them by justifying that our way of life is better than their way of life? Is that what you're saying?
If they're willing to die for their beliefs, in other words, aren't they? Obviously, there's talking about superiority. They're obviously, willing to pay the price, the ultimate price, even for their beliefs. Are they sincere? Is it okay? Is sincerity enough? In other words,
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. What gives us the right to deny their belief system?
Oh, that's a good way to say it.
Well, as I said earlier, primarily the fact that their belief system involves killing anyone who disagrees with them.
What about the Crusades of Christianity?
Well, historically, simply because the Crusades happened does not mean that I agree with them. Also, historically, the Crusades were, in my understanding, a recovery of territory that the Muslims had taken by war. So, whether or not that was the case, I haven't studied the topic, so I couldn't answer that question.
you could probably look that one up, though, in case it comes up.
Yeah, probably.
It is loosely related to, Islam, and it's not a current issue, to be sure, but...
You're saying that we're morally justified, and in one sentence, why are we morally justified?
In one sentence, we are morally justified because our culture does not support the killing of individuals who disagree with us.
Well, and can't you go further than that though, Sam? And I mean, why don't we kill people who don't believe, who disagree with us, who don't believe the same way we do? What is the foundation for that? I mean, why stop there and say, well, you do that and we don't do that? Why? What's the basis for that? Why is one right and the other not?
Well, I couldn't give you a reference for this passage, but the Bible says that God alone is God of the... Well, I don't even know if it's the Bible. Somewhere I have heard. It was either Calvin or the Bible. That God alone is God of the conscience. And as Americans, we take that a bit differently, especially since many of us are not Christians. But the concept is that... this may sound morally relativistic, but the concept is that each man needs to be secure in his own conscience that what he believes is true. And it is not anyone's position to force someone to believe something that they cannot believe be true.
But doesn't that deny your contention?
It absolutely does, because you just supported what the
However-
Muslims believe.
However, at the same time, there are certain absolutes on the moral landscape, and one of those is that men have certain rights, among them life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and that somebody who violates these rights, especially life, deserves some form of punishment.
Okay, here's my issue with that, Sam. You just backed up what we believe, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Muslims don't believe those are rights. They don't believe those are inalienable rights. So that you're saying that the foundation for our country and our beliefs is superior to theirs. You have to be able to tell why. You have to be able to go right to the source of where that truth comes from.
I think I see where we're going with this.
So when the question comes up, who are we to say that cultural reform in the Middle East is necessary, and we're going to come in and tell you what your culture should look like? It's not us against them. And that quote that you just used would actually contradicts what you're trying to say in your thesis. You need to be able to say,
But
here is absolute truth.
But are you proposing that it's a covert operation, that we're changing their culture, and that we have an obligation to society as a whole because they're just they're just point blank damaging, anybody who disagrees with them? So is that what you're saying, that it needs to be covert? We're not really saying to them, your society is, for the birds. You're just basically, how would you infiltrate their culture? Is it just through technology? Is it just through advancements? I mean...
Well, largely through the political sector, through supporting such things such as the Turkish secular government, which encourages greater human rights and all the things that we value in the West, coming back to...
Okay,
what
well, I'm a
Mrs.
little
Sachs
bit
pointed out.
confused when you say the Turkish... Oh, okay, the Turkish government. Okay, all right.
Well, I think that
Isn't that
answers it, though.
changing? I don't know.
Well, they're becoming more secular. Is that what you're saying?
Actually, they're becoming more radicalized, aren't they?
Well-
Isn't Turkey becoming more radicalized?
Segments of the culture.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Thank you for judging.
Yeah.
5 sugar, knock 'em dead.
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks, sir. Go away.
Stay warm.
Oh, door.
Oh, I did.
So Connie, we'll just meet over at 1:40. Did we say 1:45 or 2? No, we said
2.
2. If possible.
Do you want me to stop this, or should we let it keep going? Oh, you already did. I know you didn't.
No, I didn't.